The wealthiest rancher in the basin was freezing to death in a 35-below blizzard, dragging his sick son through 3 feet of snow to beg for shelter at the very dirt hole he had spent 4 months mocking. Inside the quiet 55-degree cave, the widowed father didn't open the door right away, because 4 months ago, when he abandoned his damp log cabin to raise his son inside a limestone grotto, the entire town swore grief had driven him mad. 4 months before the Arctic front locked the Pine Creek Basin of Montana territory under 3 feet of solid ice, late October 1888 arrived with a sharp, unforgiving frost. The chokecherry brush along the lower draws had shed its last leaves, and the mountain air carried that thin, metallic scent that old trappers recognized as the harbinger of a long winter. Gideon Vance was 39 years old, though 11 winters spent trapping, guiding, and cutting timber across the high country had etched deep lines around his gray eyes. He was a quiet, weathered man whose calloused hands were skilled with both a broadaxe and a mason's chisel. Behind him on the narrow bench trail walked his 8-year-old son, Eli. The boy was small for his age, with a frail chest and a persistent rasp in his breathing, the lingering mark of a childhood spent in drafty cabins. In his coat pocket, Eli's small fingers constantly clutched a worn silver locket that contained a lock of his mother's dark hair. 6 months earlier, Gideon's wife Sarah had died of a galloping lung fever inside the hand-hewn log cabin Gideon had built with his own hands. The cabin was structurally sound, but like most frontier homes, its clay chinking shrank during dry summer spells. When the winter rains arrived, dampness seeped into the logs, running down the interior walls and soaking the dirt floor. No matter how many cords of pine Gideon burned in the stove, the air remained heavy with moisture, and Sarah's breath hung in white clouds inside their bedroom until the fever finally took her. After the funeral, 3 tin cups remained on the kitchen shelf. Every morning before Eli woke, Gideon quietly turned Sarah's blue-patterned tin cup around so its handle faced the wall, ensuring his son would not reach for it by mistake. Inside the cedar storage chest, Gideon folded Sarah's favorite hand-woven blue wool shawl beneath a layer of dry lavender, unable to look at it without a crushing weight in his chest. Gideon did not blame the cabin with angry words, but he refused to repeat a system that had already cost him his wife. The idea of the cave had come to him during a late spring storm earlier that year. Gideon and his old red-boned coonhound Copper, a scar-eared hunting dog whose dark eyes read every shift in mountain wind, had taken shelter inside a natural limestone recess high above Pine Creek Gorge. While 30-degree rain and sleet coated the trees outside, Gideon noticed that the air deep inside the limestone grotto felt surprisingly mild, dry, and undisturbed by the howling wind. In August, Gideon carried a brass spirit thermometer up the slope and set it on a ledge 40 feet inside the limestone grotto. At noon, when the basin floor below reached 75 degrees, the back of the grotto measured a steady 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Before sunrise the next morning, when an early frost dropped the outdoor temperature to 28 degrees, Gideon checked the instrument again. Inside the grotto, the red mercury line remained unchanged at 48 degrees. The massive wall of natural volcanic limestone did not generate heat, it simply refused to change temperature quickly. Tons of solid, ancient rock absorbed the ambient temperature of the earth deep beneath the surface, holding a stable thermal equilibrium that resisted the wild fluctuations of the mountain weather. Gideon pressed his hand against the smooth, cool limestone wall. The rock was dry to the touch, and the air carried no scent of damp rot. "The cold hunts flat timber walls, Copper," Gideon whispered to the old hound resting at his feet. "It finds every seam, but it can't walk through 40 feet of solid mountain stone." By late October, Gideon made his decision. He did not abandon his homestead cabin entirely. It would still serve as a storage shed for heavy tools, dry hides, and summer gear. But when the deep winter cold arrived, he, Eli, and Copper would sleep inside the limestone grotto. Instead of hauling pine boards up the steep slope, Gideon loaded his pack mule with 2 heavy rolls of raw, unwashed sheep fleeces. Years on the mountain trap lines had taught him a fundamental survival rule. Wet cotton was a death sentence, but raw wool, still saturated with natural sheep lanolin, shed water like a duck's back and preserved its insulating dead air spaces even when exposed to damp air. To Gideon, those greasy, unwashed mats of lanolin wool were not trash. They were an impenetrable barrier against the wind. The first person to notice the steady stream of supplies moving up the cliff trail was Ephraim Sterling, the wealthiest cattle rancher in Pine Creek Basin. Sterling was 50 years old, an arrogant, heavy-set man who owned a sprawling two-story timber mansion on the valley floor, reinforced with iron cross-bracing and boasting two massive brick chimneys. Sterling reined in his blooded carriage horses along the lower fence line, watching Gideon lead his loaded mule toward the dark cave opening high on the ridge. "What are you building up there, Vance?" Sterling called out, his booming voice carrying across the frost-dusted pasture. "Storing meat for the winter?" Gideon paused, holding the mule's lead rope. "We're sleeping up there when the deep freeze hits, Sterling." Sterling stared at him for a moment, then let out a loud, contemptuous laugh that echoed off the rock cliffs. "Sleeping in a dirt hole. Only wild beasts live in caves, man. No child with weak lungs will survive a Montana winter inside a damp stone cave. You're losing your mind, Gideon." Down at the trading post later that afternoon, Silas Carr, a veteran freight hauler who supplied the mountain camps, overheard the conversation. Silas was a practical man who understood weather, but he shook his head in disapproval. "A cave is where a man waits out a storm for 3 hours," Silas remarked to the men gathered around the store stove. "It isn't a place a father takes a sick child to raise through a 4-month winter." Grief has clouded Gideon's judgment since Sarah passed. The town did not offer hostility. They offered pity. They assumed the widower had lost his senses to heartbreak. Gideon overheard their remarks while securing his pack saddle outside the store. He did not turn around. He did not offer an argument or defend his calculations. He simply tightened the cinch strap, lifted Eli onto the mule's back, and started the long climb back toward the limestone grotto. Nature operated on physical laws that paid no attention to gossip, wealth, or traditional timber lore, and Gideon was prepared to let the coming winter deliver the final verdict. Early November arrived in Pine Creek Basin, clad in a heavy blanket of white frost. While the families on the valley floor were busy stuffing extra river clay between their cabin logs, Gideon Vance was working methodically inside the entrance of the limestone grotto. A natural cave could not protect a family if the mountain wind was allowed to wander freely through the opening. The grotto mouth was nearly 8 feet wide, a vast archway that invited cold drafts deep into the interior. Gideon began by constructing an offset wooden vestibule using peeled lodgepole pine poles. He did not seal the mouth with a flat, rigid timber wall. Instead, he built a low, 4-foot-wide entryway frame that forced a man to duck his head upon entering. More importantly, he staggered the doorways. The outer entrance sat on the far right side of the wooden frame, while the inner doorway was offset 4 feet to the left. When cold wind rushed toward the cliff face, it could no longer blow straight into the living space. The gale hit the outer wooden frame, lost its momentum in the offset passage, and scattered harmlessly into the corners. Within the 4-foot vestibule, Gideon hung 2 heavy curtains made from unwashed, lanolin-rich sheep fleeces, spaced 5 inches apart. Eli helped his father stitch the wool panels onto the pine frame with coarse hemp twine. Between the 2 heavy wool curtains sat a 5-inch pocket of completely motionless air. That trapped air formed an invisible thermal cushion. Cold air passing through the outer curtain lost its bite in the dead air gap before ever touching the inner wool panel. The first technical test arrived sooner than expected. A sudden Arctic cold snap dropped the outdoor temperature to 19 degrees overnight. At dawn, Gideon walked to the vestibule to inspect his work. The air inside the grotto remained a comfortable 43 degrees without a fire burning. However, Gideon discovered a flaw. The bottom 3 inches of the outer lanolin wool curtain had frozen solid to the stone floor. Moisture from melting snow on their boots had pooled along the entrance threshold, soaking into the lower wool fibers and locking the curtain to the rock like iron. Gideon did not attempt to force the frozen fabric open. He unstitched the outer curtain immediately, carried it to the fire, and thawed the wool. He spent the afternoon correcting the error. He trimmed 3 inches off the bottom of both wool curtains. He built a raised wooden threshold from split cedar boards, 3 inches above the stone floor, and cut a narrow drainage groove beneath it to channel boot meltwater toward the outer slope. Along the bottom edge of the wool curtains, he attached a strip of supple, oiled deer leather that brushed lightly against the wood without ever touching wet stone. The following morning, the outer curtain hung dry, pliable, and completely free of ice. Next, Gideon turned his attention to the heating system deep inside the grotto. Unlike most settlers, who placed their stoves near the entrance for convenience, Gideon set his small, soapstone-lined cast-iron stove 30 feet deep within the chamber, near the rear wall. He ran the stovepipe upward through an opening reinforced with sheet iron, stone, and clay, extending the pipe out through a narrow natural fissure in the cliff face above. Behind the stove, Gideon constructed a reflective slate heat shield. He quarried flat slabs of dark slate from the creek bed, anchoring them 8 inches away from the rear limestone wall. When the stove burned, the intense heat did not strike the cold mountain rock directly. Instead, it hit the flat slate slabs, which absorbed the thermal energy and reflected it forward into the living area like a warm mirror. During the first trial burn, the stove warmed the chamber to 58 degrees within 2 hours. But the next morning revealed a second technical problem. A thin, shimmering film of water covered the limestone rock directly behind the slate shield. Warm room air hitting the unventilated rock face had created a condensation trap. If left unchecked, the dampness would seep into the bedding and foster mold. Gideon shut the stove down immediately. He pulled the cast-iron stove 8 inches farther away from the rock wall and stacked a loose wall of granite river boulders behind the slate shield, leaving wide air gaps at the bottom and sides. The modification created a natural convection loop. Cool air from the floor was drawn upward through the rock gaps behind the slate shield, absorbing the heat and drying the rock face completely before circulating warm, dry air throughout the room. When Gideon conducted the second test burn, the stone wall behind the stove remained bone dry. Finally, Gideon addressed the sleeping arrangements. He built an elevated wooden platform raised 16 inches off the cold dirt floor, constructing the frame from stout pine poles and woven cedar slats. Upon the platform, he laid a 6-inch mattress of dry, fragrant prairie grass, covered by 2 thick pads of lanolin wool. Over the top, he carefully spread the red and blue striped wool blanket Sarah had woven before her death. Beneath the foot of the elevated platform, Copper claimed a warm, draft-free nook of his own, settling onto a bed of dry cedar shavings. Across the chamber, Gideon built an elevated wood rack 14 inches off the ground, set 6 feet deep within the dry interior of the cave. He moved his entire stock of split pinyon pine and juniper onto the rack, arranging the logs in thin, spaced rows to allow continuous air circulation. By the middle of November, the limestone grotto was no longer a cold rock cavity in the side of a cliff. It had transformed into an engineered winter sanctuary, airtight, dry, elevated, and holding a steady ambient warmth that no surface storm could touch. One evening, after the day's work was finished, 8-year-old Eli sat on the elevated sleeping platform, his small hands holding his mother's silver locket under the yellow glow of the oil lamp. He looked around the warm, dry stone room, listening to the gentle crackle of the soapstone stove and the soft breathing of Copper sleeping below. "Papa?" Eli whispered softly, looking up at his father. Gideon paused in his work, a wooden spoon in his hand as he stirred a pot of venison stew. "Yes, Eli? It doesn't smell like cold in here anymore," the boy said quietly. Gideon looked at his son's clear, uncoughing chest, then at the dry slate wall behind the stove, and offered a rare, gentle smile. "No, son," Gideon said. "It smells like home." By the 3rd week of November, life inside the limestone grotto settled into a quiet, data-driven routine governed by precision rather than guesswork. Beside the grotto entrance hung Gideon's leather-bound weather ledger. Every morning at sunrise and every evening at dusk, Gideon recorded the exact figures: outdoor temperature, indoor temperature, firewood consumed, and the condition of 8-year-old Eli's lungs. By the end of the month, the ledger numbers formed an indisputable mathematical proof. 2 hours of burning pinyon pine and juniper in the soapstone stove warmed the entire chamber to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. 6 hours after the fire died down to gray ash, the massive limestone walls continued to radiate stored heat, holding the sleeping area at a steady, comfortable 50 degrees. Firewood consumption ran 70% lower than the average log cabin on the valley floor. It was during this period of quiet verification that Dr. Sean O'Connor arrived at the limestone grotto. Dr. O'Connor was 62 years old, a red-faced Irish wilderness physician who spent his winters riding between remote mountain homesteads, delivering medicine, treating frostbite, and checking on isolated families. He carried 2 heavy leather saddlebags filled with bandages, stethoscope, and medicinal tinctures. The old doctor stepped through the offset vestibule, parting the heavy lanolin wool curtains, and paused in sheer astonishment. He did not find a damp, dark cave filled with shivering occupants. He found a bright, bone-dry stone sanctuary illuminated by oil lamps, holding a deep, stable warmth of 55 degrees. The air was crisp, free of wood smoke, and completely dry. Dr. O'Connor sat Eli on the elevated wooden platform and pressed his brass stethoscope against the boy's chest, listening intently to the child's breathing. The doctor pulled the stethoscope from his ears, his sharp eyes wide with disbelief. "His lungs are completely clear, Gideon," Dr. O'Connor declared, shaking his head. "There isn't a trace of the wheeze that plagued him in town last winter." The old physician walked around the grotto, inspecting the elevated slate heat shield behind the stove, the raised wood rack, and the covered spring water basin. "In 30 years of frontier medicine," Dr. O'Connor said, looking at Gideon with profound respect, "I have treated dozens of children dying of lung fever inside damp, drafty log cabins where moisture ran down the walls. What you have built here is not a cave, Gideon. It is the healthiest, driest winter room in the Montana Territory." That afternoon, Ephraim Sterling rode up the trail to the limestone grotto, flanked by 2 armed cattle guards. Sterling looked over the dry wood piles, the clean vestibule, and the warm steam rising from the grotto's chimney vent with growing, dark resentment. "You think you're clever, Vance," Sterling sneered, resting his gloved hands on his saddle horn. "I've just leased the county toll road and bought the freight yards down in the valley. No supply sleds or hay wagons will cross my road to this ridge. You have 30 days before you run out of grain and wood up here. When your supplies give out, you'll sell me your claim for pennies, or watch your boy freeze in this hole." Gideon stood on his elevated wooden porch, his hand resting on Eli's shoulder, his old dog Copper sitting alertly beside his boots. His gray eyes met Sterling's gaze without a flicker of doubt. "The road belongs to you, Sterling," Gideon replied quietly, his voice steady as granite. "The mountain belongs to us. Get off my land." Sterling laughed bitterly, gathered his reins, and galloped back down the trail into the valley. Inside the grotto, Gideon opened his ledger, calculating their reserves. With the 70% reduction in firewood usage and their stored provisions of dry venison, rye flour, and fresh spring water, they were not facing starvation. They were prepared for a 30-day winter siege. To prepare for the storm, Gideon set stout wooden marker posts every 18 feet down the slope, connecting the grotto entrance, the wood rack, and the water basin with a thick, tarred hemp guide rope. He knew that when an Arctic whiteout struck, a man could lose his orientation 3 feet from his own door and freeze to death in his own yard. On the 27th day of November, the weather over the Pine Creek Basin delivered its final warning. The wind died completely at noon. The clouds lowered until they seemed to rest upon the high pine tops, a flat, unbroken ceiling of leaden gray. The brass barometer in the grotto dropped to a level Dr. O'Connor had never recorded in 30 years of mountain travel. The birds vanished from the trees, wild deer descended into deep subterranean ravines, and Copper paced nervously along the vestibule, his ears twitching at subaudible pressure shifts. Gideon walked down to his old log cabin one last time. He opened the cedar chest, picked up Sarah's blue wool shawl, and folded it carefully into a sealed wooden box, locking it away without a trace of guilt or hesitation. The past was honored, but his duty was to the living. He walked back up the mountain, pulled Eli and Copper into the limestone grotto, and secured the heavy outer timber door of the vestibule. The work was done. Now, nature was about to speak. The great Arctic wave of 1888 struck the Pine Creek Basin before sunrise on the 28th day of November. It did not begin as soft drifting snowfall. It arrived as a terrifying 60-mile-an-hour Arctic gale driving razor-sharp ice crystals across the mountains in a blinding whiteout. The temperature plunged 35 degrees below zero and locked the basin in a sub-zero vice that held unbroken for 3 weeks. Down in the valley, the illusion of frontier timber wealth turned into a cold nightmare. Inside Ephraim Sterling's grand 2-story mansion, the unseasoned pine logs contracted violently in the 35 below air. The clay chinking shrank and flaked away, leaving wide gaps between the timbers. Freezing wind poured into every room like water through a broken dam. Sterling's hands burned through his entire 3-cord firewood reserve in less than 10 days, but the draft stripped heat faster than the fires could produce it. His cattle froze in their pens, and his young son developed a terrifying rattling cough that turned into a spiking fever. High on the mountain ridge, inside the limestone grotto, the difference between building against nature and working with it was measured in survival. The massive volcanic limestone walls absorbed the storm's impact, holding the living area at a steady, unwavering 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The offset vestibule and double lanolin wool curtains trapped dead air perfectly, preventing a single draft from entering the room. Eli sat on the elevated wooden platform, reading his schoolbook by the warm glow of the oil lamp, his lungs clear and quiet. Gideon, Eli, and Copper crossed between the grotto entrance and the wood rack, using the tarred hemp guide rope, completely safe from losing their way in the blinding whiteout. Then, on the 4th night of the Arctic wave, a sudden emergency threatened their sanctuary. A massive snowdrift, whipped up by a 70-mile-an-hour gust, accumulated over the upper cliff ledge, capping the primary pumice smoke vent with a 5-inch block of solid ice. Inside the grotto, the stove draft suddenly weakened. A faint, acrid haze of pine smoke began to gather near the ceiling beams. Gideon noticed the change instantly. If the exhaust vent remained choked, carbon monoxide and smoke would fill the airtight chamber within an hour, forcing them out into the killing storm. Gideon reached for his heavy coat, an iron drill rod, and a coil of tarred hemp rope. He tied one end of the rope securely around his waist and handed the other end to 8-year-old Eli. "If I give 3 sharp tugs on this line, Eli," Gideon commanded, his gray eyes fierce with determination, "pull with every ounce of strength you have." Eli gripped the rough hemp line, his small jaw set in the same stubborn lines as his father's. "I won't let go, Papa." Gideon parted the lanolin wool curtains and forced his way out into the roaring 35 below whiteout. The Arctic gale hit him like a solid iron wall. Blinding ice crystals sliced his face like razor blades, erasing all visibility beyond 2 feet. Gideon dropped to his knees, gripping the guide rope, crawling inch by inch along the narrow cliff ledge toward the upper ventilation shaft. A loose sheet of shale gave way beneath his boots, sending him sliding toward the ravine edge, but he held fast to the rope. Working by touch alone with numb, bleeding fingers, Gideon located the frozen pumice vent overhead. He slammed the iron drill rod upward into the ice cap, hammering the metal into the frozen plug with all his strength. Once, twice. On the 3rd strike, the ice cap shattered with a sharp crack. A shower of frozen snow collapsed into the vent, followed instantly by a powerful roaring draft as the stove suction caught once more, pulling the cold air upward through the pipe. Exhausted, shivering violently, Gideon reached for the guide rope and gave 3 hard, rhythmic tugs. Inside the offset vestibule, Eli felt the 3 sharp jerks on the line. "Pull, Copper!" the boy cried out. With the old hound pulling beside him, Eli hauled the heavy hemp rope through the doorway with all his strength, the rough fibers leaving deep, red pressure marks on his small wrists, until his father's ice-encrusted coat emerged through the wool curtains into the warm grotto. Gideon collapsed onto the dry earth floor, gasping for air, his coat caked thick in frost. Eli threw his arms around his father's neck, holding him tight as the stove draft hummed quietly overhead, clearing the last trace of smoke from the room. The next morning, Dr. Sean O'Connor arrived at the limestone grotto, dragging a half-frozen Ephraim Sterling and Sterling's feverish son through chest-high snowdrifts. Sterling was weeping, his pride entirely shattered, his hands blackening with frostbite. He had abandoned his freezing mansion after his stoves ran out of wood, desperate to save his sick child. Dr. O'Connor carried Sterling's boy inside, laying him on a bed of wool blankets near the soapstone stove, while Gideon prepared hot venison broth. Dr. O'Connor listened to Sterling's son's rattling chest, then turned to examine Eli. The doctor pressed his stethoscope against Eli's back, finding his lungs completely clear, his skin warm, his breathing steady. Ephraim Sterling looked around the warm, 55-degree stone sanctuary in utter shock. He saw the dry wood racks, the steaming water basin, the elevated sleeping platform, and Eli resting comfortably without a single cough. Sterling lowered his head into his frostbitten hands, sobbing in open shame and remorse. He looked up at Gideon, his voice cracking with emotion, as he asked the only question that mattered to a father. "Does the boy wake up cold, Gideon?" Gideon looked at his healthy son, then at the warm, glowing limestone wall behind the stove, and answered quietly, "No." The great Arctic wave finally released its grip on the Pine Creek Basin on the morning of December 20th. When the sun broke over the high mountain ridges for the first time in 3 weeks, it revealed a landscape that had been entirely rewritten by the storm. The sky was a pale, blinding blue, and the air was deathly still. 5 feet of wind-carved snow buried the lower valley roads, but high on the ridge, the entrance to the limestone grotto remained open, dry, and clear. Down in the basin, the cost of winter neglect was tallied in heavy, silent losses. Ephraim Sterling had lost more than half his cattle herd in shattered, uninsulated pens. Most surface homesteaders had burned through their entire winter firewood supply in 20 days, forcing families to chop up fence posts and wooden furniture just to keep their stoves burning. Yet inside Gideon Vance's limestone grotto, every occupant woke to a warm, dry morning. Sterling's 6th son had recovered under Dr. O'Connor's care, his fever broken by the steady, 55-degree warmth radiating from the volcanic limestone wall. Water flowed continuously from the covered internal basin, and the wood rack deep inside the chamber was still half full. Late that afternoon, Silas Carr, the freight hauler who had questioned Gideon's judgment in town months earlier, rode his horse up the snow-packed trail to compare numbers. Silas stood inside the offset vestibule, looking at the 2 lanolin wool curtains, the raised wood rack, and the charcoal temperature marks recorded on the limestone wall. The figures in Gideon's weather ledger required no argument. Over 3 full weeks of sub-zero temperatures, where outdoor readings plunged to 35 below, Gideon had burned less than a single cord of pinyon pine and juniper. Silas Carr had burned nearly 3 cords in his timber cabin and spent the storm shivering beside a smoking stove. Silas closed the ledger, handed it back to Gideon, and extended a rough, calloused hand. "I told the men at the store that a cave was a place where people waited to be rescued, Gideon," Silas said, his voice quiet, stripped of all former skepticism. "I was a fool. You built a sanctuary where the mountain carries the winter away." Gideon looked at the veteran freight hauler, took his hand, and gave it a firm, quiet shake. "The mountain did the work, Silas. I just stopped fighting it with flat wood." 2 days later, Ephraim Sterling brought his family up the trail to thank Gideon before moving to town for the remainder of the winter. Sterling, his hands wrapped in clean linen bandages, stood before the grotto entrance, unable to look Gideon in the eye. "I called your home a dirt hole, Gideon," Sterling said, his voice cracking with genuine remorse. "I threatened your claim because I was too proud to admit my $5,000 mansion was a drafty tinderbox. You saved my boy's life when my own house turned into an ice cave." Sterling reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a signed legal release, formally dropping all claims and liens against Gideon's property. "I want you to help me design offset vestibules and raised wood storage for every homestead built in Pine Creek next spring, Gideon. I'll pay whatever wages you ask." Sterling never rebuilt his 2-story timber mansion. When spring arrived, he constructed a modest stone and alcove home near the river, his former arrogance forever cured by the night he dragged his son through the snow. When spring finally returned to the Pine Creek Basin in May of 1889, the high meadows turned emerald green, and wild chokecherries bloomed along the cliffs. Gideon walked down to his old homestead cabin one quiet morning. The air was warm, scented with wild pine and blooming sage. He opened the cedar chest, reached past his tools, and lifted out Sarah's blue-patterned wool shawl. For the first time in a year, he felt no crushing weight of guilt in his chest, only peace. He carried the blue shawl up to the limestone grotto, where 8-year-old Eli was sitting on the elevated slate porch playing with copper in the spring sunshine. Gideon walked over and gently draped his mother's blue wool shawl over the boy's shoulders. Eli looked up at his father, a bright, clear smile touching his face. He wrapped the blue shawl around himself, stroked Copper's soft copper ears, and let out a happy, ringing laugh that echoed off the high limestone cliffs. Gideon sat beside his son on the porch, watching the green valley below. The old wooden sign at the trailhead remained, but the people of Pine Creek gave the cliff shelter a new name that endured through generations of Montana herders: the Limestone Sanctuary. Summer arrived in the Pine Creek Basin in June 1889, bringing warm, resin-scented breezes and long, golden afternoons that thawed the high mountain meadows. When the new construction began that summer, settlers and ranchers did not line up at the timber mills to buy thin pine planks for flat, vertical walls. Instead, long lines of horse-drawn wagons creaked up the winding bench trail to Gideon Vance's claim. Builders, mason apprentices, and homesteaders from 3 counties arrived at the limestone grotto, not to mock, but with sketch pads, measuring tapes, and notebooks, eager to learn the principles of thermal mass and air circulation. Gideon and Eli turned no one away. Together, father and son stood outside the grotto entrance, teaching every family in the territory how to construct offset vestibules, how to hang lanolin wool draft curtains, how to raise wood racks 14 inches off cold ground, and how to build reflective slate heat shields behind stoves. Gideon showed them how an offset entrance breaks wind velocity, how 2 layers of lanolin wool trap a cushion of dead air, and how backing a stove with slate slabs reflects heat into a room while preventing rock condensation. He shared the barometric charts and temperature logs from his weather ledger, proving that a home engineered with thermal mass requires less than a third of the wood traditional cabins burn. Under Gideon's direction, dozens of new homesteads across the Pine Creek district were constructed with offset entryways, raised timber sleeping platforms, and stone-backed heat shields. Across the Montana Territory, these thermal design elements became standard winter construction for mountain homesteads, recorded in territorial survey maps and land office ledgers under a permanent, respected name, the Vance Thermal Chambers. Dr. Sean O'Connor published an official medical report in the Territorial Medical Journal documenting Eli Vance's complete recovery from chronic respiratory illness after sleeping inside the limestone grotto. His published findings proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that dry, subterranean thermal stability was far superior to damp, drafty timber cabins for human lung health during alpine winters. Dr. O'Connor's paper became a mandatory reference for frontier wilderness physicians throughout the Northwest. Years rolled by across the high territory, bringing prosperous harvests and quiet peace to Pine Creek Gorge. Eli grew into a strong, healthy young man, attending the Territorial College and eventually becoming a respected wilderness doctor under Dr. O'Connor's mentorship, carrying his father's ledger and his mother's silver locket wherever his medical rounds took him. Copper, the faithful red-boned coonhound, lived out his long life resting comfortably in the warm, windless sunlight on the grotto porch, his coat glossy and his dark eyes peaceful, guarding the family until his quiet end at 16 years of age. Decades later, long after the original wooden towns in the valley below had vanished, the limestone grotto inside Pine Creek Gorge stood strong, its offset pine pole vestibule and reflective slate heat shield completely untouched by time. A modest bronze plaque was eventually mounted on the volcanic limestone rock face beside the entrance, bearing a simple inscription chosen by the townspeople. He built where the cold could not follow. The story of Gideon Vance was never simply about limestone caves, lanolin wool, or 35 below whiteouts. It stood as an enduring, timeless testament to a frontier truth, that nature never surrenders to human pride, and survival is not granted to those who build higher, flatter walls to fight the storm. The greatest protection is often the one hidden in the shadow of the mountain, waiting for a man wise enough to listen to the earth. And when the great Arctic winter comes to deliver its final judgment, the only witness whose opinion truly matters is the mountain itself.